This is with video 3 of week 2. So one way of capturing this difficulty in characterizing the multilingual, and one way of conceiving them or conceptualizing of the phenomenon of multilingualism is to consider that multilingualism is not a categorical measure. So it's not that that there are very well established limits to who counts as multilingual and who counts as monolingual, but rather that we are in front of a situation of a continuum, sometimes called the multilingual continuum or the multilingual scale, and that is more of a situation in which we have a continuum between, on the one side, a purely monolingual, hypothetically monolingual person who knows and uses only one language, doesn't even use those borrowings that I've been mentioning to you, which are the minimal expression of multilingualism, and never says pizza or sushi or anything like that. And of course, such a person hardly speaks, but that would be like the idealized monolingual person, and that would be in one extreme of the continuum. And on the other extreme of the continuum, there will be the person who has equal proficiency in all their languages, who understands, speaks, reads, and writes equally perfectly well, or at least not well, but at least in perfect synchrony in all of their languages. That would be an ideal multilingual that also does not really exist. Most people would be at some point in the multilingual continuum. So whenever you characterize a multilingual, you would have to put them in as a point in the scale between strict monolingualism and strict balance multilingualism. So the multilingual continuum is a crucial conceptual construct of how to understand multilingual lives and multilingual proficiencies. There is an added complication, which is not specific to the study of multilingualism, but that spills over into studying multilingualism, and is that whenever we say, okay, a multilingual person is a person who knows several languages. Of course, the first question we might pose is, well, what is a language? We have said what is a multilingual, but now we can narrow it down to, well, what do we consider a language? What is the definition of being a language? And therefore, who counts as bilingual on the parameters of what a language is or it isn't? For example, if someone speaks Dutch and Frisian, everybody would agree that that person is multilingual, because Dutch and Frisian are two different languages, universally recognized as different objects, linguistic objects. Therefore, if you speak Dutch and Frisian, nobody can tell you, okay, you're not multilingual, you are bilingual. Yeah. How about if someone speaks Drents and Dutch? Well, Drents is not recognized officially in the Netherlands, so it is recognized as a dialect. Now, what counts as a language or a dialect is mostly, as you have likely and hopefully seen in other classes, it's more of a political rather than scientific decision. So that Frisian is considered a separate language, while Drents is not quite. Is just something that has very little to do with scientific considerations. So while a person that speaks Dutch and Frisian will universally be recognized as a bilingual, a person who speaks Drents, or Gronings for that matters, and Dutch might not be universally recognized. It does not mean that they will not be recognized in certain circles as multilingual, but in some other circles they will just not as straightforwardly as someone who speaks Dutch and Frisian. How about someone who speaks Afrikaans and Dutch? The same happens as with Drents. It's just that in this case, it's not within the boundaries of a single country, but same linguistic consideration about values and judgments apply to Afrikaans and Dutch. And just to show you that this is not a Dutch problem, the same happens if someone speaks Swabian versus High German. in some contexts, you would ask that person, okay, are you multilingual? And they would say, well, no, I just speak German and this dialect that is very cute and everything, but I wouldn't call a language myself. And in some other contexts, they would say, well, yes, of course, right? Of course, I speak two languages because that's what Suebian is, a language, etc. The same happens, as I said, this is not just a Northern European or a Germanic question. The same happens if you speak, for example, Italian and Veronese. It will be recognized as a multilingual perspective, a multilingual competency in some context and not. So what that means is that in order to even approach the question of what a language is or isn't, we have to have an idea of how to answer the conundrum of deciding whether, when you have two linguistic forms, so two objects, two linguistic objects, two grammars, two ways of speaking, two ways of communicating, whether they are the same language, those two ways belong to the same category, linguistic category, they are just one language, or they are different languages. If you decide that they are the same language, you might decide that they are the same language and just some kind of accent, or you might decide that they are the same language and two different dialects. There are many ways in which you can decide that they belong to the same category, but they are distinct from each other at a perceptual level. But you might also decide that the differences are so big that they actually are two separate languages, two separate linguistic systems, two separate linguistic entities. And then you might end up with a situation in which two objects that look very different from a perceptual point of view, two languages that sound very different, that have structures that are very different, have morphology that is very different, they are actually the same category, the same linguistic category. They're actually the same languages. They are two dialects of the same language, the same way that you have here in the picture that a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, they have very little in common when you look at them. Chihuahua is more, I don't know, like a cat, if you want, and the Great Dane is more similar to a Shetland pony than it would be to the Chihuahua itself. Nevertheless, we decide that Chihuahuas and Great Danes are two dialects, are two species, not species, they're two elements, they're two breeds, that's how we call them. They're two breeds of the same animal, the same species, the canid. Now, you can also end up with the opposite case, in which two objects that look very similar to each other at a perceptual level, to forms of speaking that actually they understand each other pretty well in the right circumstances, and they look very similar according to some analysis, they are actually two linguistic objects of different languages. The same way in the picture here, those two individuals, they have many similar characteristics, but we decide to put them in different categories. One is a human, and the other one is a dog. So again, when you encounter two different ways of speaking, or two different ways, or two different ways or linguistic objects, then you have to decide whether they belong to the same language and they are just two dialects, for example, or they are separate languages. And that would influence your judgment whether a person who speaks both of them would be a bilingual person or would just be a monolingual person who speaks different registers or different varieties of the same language. And the second one, you might not want to call bilingual or multilingual, while the first one, you might want to apply the label of multilingual. Now, why is this important? It is important because when you study the phenomenon of multilingualism, you study the individuals, you encounter a first problem. And the problem, as Bialystok expresses here very well, is the following. The problem is that the decision about who to include as bilingual must precede evidence for what effect bilingualism has on these children, on the bilingual children. A situation that is logically reversed. What does that mean? That means that you are studying whether multilingualism has any effect on people. But first, you have to characterize the people that show the effects of being multilingual. So it is a little bit circular, and it is a problem because you decide who counts as multilingual in part based on your decision of the effects that multilingualism has on people. For example, that they present a certain characteristics that they call themselves multilingual, for example. A second related problem in the study of multilingualism is that, again, expressed very well by Bialystok. Let me read. It says, to understand the role of bilingualism in children's development, therefore, not only must bilingualism be defined precisely, who counts as bilingual and who doesn't count as bilingual, but also must it be separated from the myriad of social conditions with which it is correlated and linguistic contingencies with which it is confounded. Because multilingualism does not occur in a vacuum. Multilingualism is not the same, might not have the same effects if it's recognized as a richness of a child, for example, because, oh, well, how cute, the kid speaks 3 foreign languages, and that kid goes to a rich school, for example, and those languages are appreciated, and the kid is praised all the way. For trying to speak or for having those languages. That's a very different situation for the situation in which, my God, the kid comes without knowing the language of the school system. And that is a problem because it's not that the kid does not speak any other language, he speaks some other language, but not the language that is the target of school. Therefore, that kid is not enriched, but that kid is a challenge. That kid has problems, and that goes into the kid's inner perception of themselves. And then that might cause very different developments. So multilingualism can be in the first context, in the privileged context, it might be something that makes kids more prone to show their abilities. And in the other case, the case of the underprivileged, that might be something that the kids are ashamed of or something that is perceived as a problem. Therefore, that kid will have problems in school. So to separate the effects that multilingualism per se, just the mere fact of speaking more than one language or having more than one language has on the cognitive performance of children from the effects that many socio-economical and psychological conditions that come linked to the environment that make those kids multilingual, that would be a challenge. And this is, unfortunately, as we will see, this is not always taken into consideration. The multilingual people not only come in different kinds according to all these parameters that I have presented to you, but they also come in from different social, personal, family situations, and that has to be taken into account when we examine them. Yet another problem number 3 of how we can study multilingualism is that typically we need to compare multilinguals with monolinguals because monolinguals will be our control group. We might well be studying monolinguals compared to multilinguals, and multilinguals being the control group. It doesn't really matter, but the thing is that we are comparing people or groups of people that differ on the axis of how many languages, how many linguistic systems they have or they use in a regular basis. This, of course, is highly problematic because it might be the case. Because obviously, bilingual children are never exactly the same as otherwise comparable monolingual children, except for the number of languages they speak. My bilingual children, as I have presented to you in last class, they come with their own personalities, their own internal diversity, etc. One bilingual children might not be the same as another bilingual children. One monolingual children might not be the same as another monolingual children, obviously. So you will have to make generalizations, and language might not be the most prominent factor that groups those individuals together, even if it's the one that you want to target. This is a little bit, I always put this example of these twins that are very unusual because they are in an interracial couple, and then one of them was born with what we will classify as being part of a white ethnicity, and the other one would be of a black ethnicity, and this is just based mostly on their appearance. But since we do have appearances associated with those ethnicities, that's how they have been reported as a curiosity, right? So we have they are twins, so same father, same mother, same family, pretty much the same genes, and then one of them comes out as black and the other one comes out as white. So you might say, oh, perfect case to study the effect that racial profiling and racial makeshift has on the personality of the person. Now, yes, yeah, right, because they do differ in that parameter, but these are two individuals that might differ in many other under many other parameters. So they one might be extroverted, the other one might be introverted. Naturally, one might be more of a thinker, the other one might be more of an actor, etc. Right? So then to decide that just because of their ethnicity identification, which is something pretty much external, but people interiorize it, of course. So to decide that it's because of their racial or ethnic identification that the differences can be explained is to simplify a little bit too much, right? So the same with multilinguals. To assume that different cognitive performances might be influenced and crucially influenced by the fact that they speak only one language, that might be a little generalizing a little bit too much, because you have a very diverse group, obviously. And of course, on top of it, the big problem is that multilingualism is a scale, is a gradual scale. So making groups, let's compare monolinguals versus multilinguals, is difficult because it is a continuum, remember? So if you're going to cut it here and say, like, okay, this will count as multilingual, this will count as monolingual, but of course, the ones that are here, they will be much more similar than the ones that are farther away in the scale. So that makes making groups very difficult and making comparisons very difficult and very prone to making mistakes or gross overgeneralizations that would have no scientific status. And of course, deciding on monolinguals is equally difficult, by the way. So who is a prototypical native speaker of English, for example, right? Who counts as being monolingual? It's also scale. And it also, if you're going to study the effects of being monolingual on the psychosocial, cultural makeshift of a person, just because of being monolingual, you will encounter the same difficulties. That is very hard to determine who counts as monolingual, the same way that it's hard to determine who counts as multilingual. So whenever we talk about the group of multilinguals have these characteristics or that other characteristic, blah, blah, blah. So it's just very difficult to determine, and that's a big problem that we will have to take a stand on. Now, I don't want to depress you. I don't want to make you think that then the study of multilingualism or monolingualism or language or anything whatsoever is impossible. The solution is just, well, let's do as best as we can. In the words of Bialystok again, and I'm reading, participants in the experiments need to be comparable on the dimensions that matter. So monolinguals and bilinguals must represent similar social backgrounds because that matters, whether you're a privileged multilingual versus an underprivileged multilingual, and the way you are judged about your multilingualism matters, and that depends on pretty much your social background. And bilinguals must use their two languages in the same types of context. You cannot take a totally diglossic multilingual and then compare it with a multilingual that uses all languages in all situations. So you will have to define very much your subjects and to try to make them as similar as possible according to all the dimensions in which we know that multilingual proficiency and development plays a role. Okay?